Tonight, on Arming Main Street Radio, Connor makes a promise.
We're going to try to, continue our discussion from last week around big versus small government.
Yeah.
I won't derail us too early.
And keeps it.
I honestly don't think it's a tangent this time.
Sort of.
My question kind of gets back to a point you made earlier, right? With
Kendall justifies his trust issues.
Because I don't trust people. I really don't trust white America to just chill. And I think I have valid reasons for that.
Historically speaking, absolutely.
And
An anonymous guest attempts to contribute to the conversation.
Do you think there's going to be a big government role in vaccine passports in our country?
Nope.
Don't wanna be an American.
All right. Welcome to Arming Main Street. I'm Kendall. That's Connor. And let's get into it. So what are we talking about, Connor?
So this week, we're going to try to continue our discussion from last week around big versus small government. But this week, I think we're going to frame the discussion around sort of everything going around us today, basically. So today, I got the COVID vaccine, my second dose, Team Pfizer, because that's a thing apparently. Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions we want to have answered by the end of the show. I think the first one is, should the government be able to force you to get a vaccine? Where does public health meet personal health? And, what are your rights to privacy? And then, like we said, we're going to couch this in sort of a big government versus small government, identity, politics, type breakdown.
Yep.
And yeah, really try to tackle this, COVID crisis question that we're dealing with right now. Fourth wave, we're in Michigan, so, we're at sort of an epicenter,
Right.
so to speak. Super relevant, super topical.
Yeah. So I think I can tee us off here. So I think on its face, we're going to end up agreeing that the government cannot force you to get a vaccine that you don't want. This is tough for me because part of me is very much in the camp of, yes, force everybody to get the vaccine for their own good and for everybody else's good. But it's a slippery slope, right? And that's the problem with it is how many other things then will become, well, this is for your own good, just do it.
Right.
And so I think when it comes to government, you kind of have to take the good with the bad sometimes. And so while I wish 100% of U.S. adults would get vaccinated, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. But I think to protect our ideas around rights and freedoms, we're kind of there. Now, that being said, I think businesses absolutely should be able to force you to get the vaccine as an employee. Absolutely. I have no problem with that. And we can roll into that a little later. But yeah, that's kind of my opening monologue.
I have no problems with the market coercion. I do have problems with the government coercion. So, we're kind of on the same page there also. Yeah. I do want to, poke the bear a little bit, so to speak, with it, because what comes to mind is, bakeries around gay rights issues. Right. When you're saying, all right, you have the right to discriminate your business practices on certain principles that we've now deemed guaranteed, human rights. So, it gets to be sort of an interesting topic. We'll couch that for later since we want to get into more of the meat of stuff up front. So, I won't derail us too early.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, with COVID vaccines, mm-hmm. Typically when you talk big government versus small government, that's typically how do we want our market set up? Mm-hmm. Do we want it with individuals setting up the market, or do we want government coming in and doing something to that market? In this case, I kind of feel like because the vaccines are historically effective, mm-hmm. right? If you get Pfizer or Moderna, especially, your odds of getting horribly ill with COVID are very slim.
Right, but it is also a short history. We do have to
True.
acknowledge, like, what, these vaccines have been in existence for a year
Yep.
and a half, to some extent.
I will give the
Probably not that much.
caveat, though, that the technology has been in development for about a decade.
Yeah, and I'm in total agreement here because, like, the fact that we haven't deployed this sooner just goes to, I think, a lot of my issues with big government and with big companies, large enterprises, and the bureaucratic processes that sort of slowed things down and kind of prevent risk-taking by our largest institutions in the name of stagnation. I'm not really sure.
Well, I think in the name of not going too big and losing your seat or whatever. But I also would argue in this case, we've seen sort of what competent government can do. They have done a solid job of getting the vaccines out to everybody. I will say that I think faster would have been calling in the military to organize it logistically, because it is, quite frankly, the greatest logistical organization on the face of the planet.
Yeah.
So I probably would have done that. But
I think coming off the tensions of essentially this transition of power we're going through, I think is definitely a lot to do with why we didn't see that.
Exactly.
I absolutely could see, some flaring, maybe not even from Fox News this time, but some of the even further right outlets like OWN and, Breitbart and Alex Jones and shit saying like, oh my gosh, here they come, big government's coming for you now.
Right.
Right. Because it's kind of interesting to me, with the way in which the left tends to, and the media tends to portray the right with this sort of large fascist, white nationalist movement that's sort of brewing. And, whether that's what it is, which that's what I think it is, that's what I think a lot of people would call it. Whether they want to call themselves something different, that's up to them.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I think that I find it interesting, the comparison, right, where one of the things that enables Hitler's rise to power is sort of this militarization and centralization of power, at the center of their seat of government, which happened to be while Hitler was chancellor or whatever, and then he used that move to further insulate power. So it makes sense why they didn't want to do it when Trump was there, but it also makes sense why doing it under Biden would be perceived as just the exact same thing, and we have to really guard these positions of power that I feel like big government has been way more lax with lately.
I mean, ultimately, because we have kicked the can down the road on so many issues and not taken things seriously that need... I mean, Barack Obama, no matter where your politics lie, he left a literal playbook of how to handle a global pandemic because he knew it was coming, as most people did, and we got rid of that and didn't take care of it. So there are those sorts of preparedness things, but ultimately, I think the problem is, and we've talked about this a lot off air, is we're sort of running headlong into, okay, like we were talking about last week, what were our systems of government, right? Monarchies. The thing about monarchies is, when you get a good monarch, they're great. The problem is the odds of getting a good monarch are slim and none, and the odds that the transition of power will be stable, slim and none. Communism. The reason communism falls is because basically communism is a monarchy, except worse. Like if you get a person with sort of totalitarian leanings, it's not going to end well. And also, people just feel that restriction of their rights. Right. Like, folks in Cuba weren't allowed to own businesses and things that to us as Americans, we just take for granted. So then democracy comes into play. And democracy is great because it is very stable. The problem is it is built on public trust, which in our country is really hard to come by because when our country was founded, there was a small subset of people that could vote. Now everybody can vote, which is obviously a great thing, but that trust in our government is not there.
I think that there's an area to investigate there more. Why is the trust not there?
Oh, well, because I think The problem is government. I agree that government is inefficient. So instead of I guess, especially with like the vaccine issue, right? There's probably a more expedient way to have gotten these vaccines out, but because of our current situation in government and everything that happened, even that prior summer, we probably can't go down this route, right?
Right.
So I think that's definitely a part of it, and of course we'll talk about that sort of government inefficiency, but just couching it in public health, I think our democracy is slow to react to things, and that gets us into trouble.
And I think that's one of the biggest disadvantages of a democracy. I don't think that the issue with the democracy is that, like, we don't have, like, what I like about democracy is obviously everyone having a voice, right, and being able to voice themselves and their alternatives, right? But one of the things that it promotes, right, is this sort of gridlock, this two-party solution that's couched in distractions as opposed to actual, because it becomes a way to insulate power, because in our situation, democracy is purchased. So it doesn't matter that you get a voice if your voice can't be heard. It's your voice being heard that matters. And I think that, like, sure, we could try to regulate equality into our elections. I don't see that happening because the people who would be writing those laws are currently benefiting from the fact that that's not how it is.
Right.
So what do we actually do then in this situation where we can't trust our government because our government was bought, but our government's telling us they're not bought and that we should trust them?
Right. And that's where, specifically in the case of vaccines, I personally urge everybody to get it. Because just scientifically, right? Like, that's when you lean on facts.
Right.
And maybe not just, what our president or vice president are telling you to do. I think it's tough, though, in the sense that with our vaccine, we've got at least 50% of U.S. adults with one shot, but polls are showing that pretty much that other 50% are people that just don't plan on getting the vaccine or are really worried. What is scary to me about America is we are in a weird place. I won't even call it weird. I think we're in a place that we've always sort of been in different ways, shapes, and forms. There's massive distrust of our government. And then on the flip side of that, there's also a lot of tribalism going on. We don't necessarily just see ourselves all as Americans. There's also, and this is something that we haven't talked a ton about, but I think this is true too, prior generations went through a lot more together. World War I, World War II, the Depression,
Civil War.
Cold War. Like, there are prior generations that were like, look.
Well, wouldn't our generation then be the war on terror, the never-ending war?
Possibly,
The war
but
for
that
the
didn't
petrodollar?
that didn't make us have to sacrifice anything.
Right.
That's the difference, is that shared sacrifice. We don't have that today.
Right, and that's more from the younger half of the millennial generation, like ourselves, right? Like, we're these cuspers that have this different perspective, because, like, we were first graders when 9/11 happened? Yeah, I have memories of it, but I'm not Dan Crenshaw. I didn't go fight for this. Right? And I'm not Pete Buttigieg. I wasn't over there.
Right.
These guys who are the millennials coming to power today, maybe Pete's on the older end of that. I'm not even sure.
No, he's in there.
38.
Yeah, he's in there.
Okay, he's in there.
Yeah.
But like, these guys who are supposed to represent our generation, right? They don't feel very representative to me, in either case, because I don't feel like either one of them. I don't feel like the experiences I had were shared. They were in college when these things happened, and I'm in first grade. How is it's just digressing into, like, the way we create even more tribalism within our culture is just dividing around these experiences. But, one could say that it has had a profound effect on the millennials who are coming to power now, but not necessarily us or the following generation, where our greatest struggle probably exists online or in, FOMO or luxury, not having, because the world is so much more consumer and like individualistic focused now, I guess.
True, but
And now we're derailing. But
no, I think our great galvanizing thing will be climate change, frankly, because it's going to affect everybody. But yeah, where I was going with
that going to be, how short is that time horizon? Because I feel like we're still probably like 20, 25 years out from feeling real effects from it.
And will we do any, will we actually make change? Because I feel like every generation in their mid-20s is like, let's change the world, and by your mid-30s, you're comfortable, you have a family, you're exhausted. How do we combat that?
I think the thing with climate change is
Right.
just, there won't be any, I can just run away from this. It'll
Yeah.
be like, that was the 10th freak snowstorm in Texas this week. I don't know what's going on, so
Right.
I think at some point we're just going to reach that, but ultimately, turn down my mic a little bit, sorry peeps. I think ultimately, for me personally, when I think about going back to health, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are we going to do when the next gigantic pandemic comes? How do we educate folks such that they understand that typically vaccines will be safe? And I completely understand those people that are like, look, let's wait till we get out of trials. I want to see a couple million people get it, see what kind of happens. I understand that. But and this is what scares me about America, we are in a place now where people will observe something with their own two eyes, and then because they don't like it or because they're involved in some echo chamber, they're like, nah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I personally get a little scared.
A doubling down, so to speak. It's like,
Mhm.
well, I was wrong before, but I don't want to admit that I'm wrong, and I'm going to get called out for me being wrong.
Yep.
Instead of just accepting it as a opportunity of growth.
Or the steep political cost as far as you and your community, right?
Yeah.
That's the other thing. So if everybody in your community is not getting the vaccine and you're the one person that gets the vaccine, it's not going to end too well for you. And I think that ultimately, there again, that goes to big government, small government.
Mm-hmm.
Big government would say, everybody's getting the vaccine. Small government might say, look, if you live in rural Wyoming, you're probably fine, ultimately.
Yeah.
How many people are you seeing a week?
Right.
It's about isolation.
And that's
Yeah.
usually where those topics of conversation lie, is the rural communities are just I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I'm not experiencing any of this.
And the thing is, that's where every discussion lies, because
Right.
it comes out of, do you belong to one of these inner coastal elite cities, right, where the Democrats have their strongholds, or do you belong to rural America, so to speak, or suburban America, where the right has their hold to some extent? It's almost like the new age labor class, right? All these tech workers, finance workers, these went to really great schools, and now they have really great paying salaries, and they think that everyone should have these opportunities, right? But ultimately, they're just a laboring class. They're a knowledge laboring class, versus the entrepreneurial class who lives in the suburbs to some extent, who have small businesses that, support rural economic systems and, kind of represent an older version of America, but to some extent are also the backbone, because they prop up most of the jobs in these cities in some extent through their consumer culture. And then in addition to that, they provide a lot of the food infrastructure, a lot of these subsidized government infrastructures that these cities absolutely need to subsist on, that they couldn't run without the rest of the country.
Right.
And then you could also then reverse that discussion and talk about taxes, because obviously most of the money is in these big economic centers, but the taxes go back out to these communities.
Right.
And there's a reason for that, obviously, because of the economic exchange going on there.
Here's my biggest argument. especially when it comes to that balance. Like, one of the things we wanted to talk about, right, is that balance between public health, personal health, and your right to privacy. Can we force people to get vaccines? Red states will not, right? And I don't think blue states either. I honestly think this is more of a theoretical discussion. I do not believe the U.S. government will force people to be vaccinated.
No, it doesn't seem likely at all.
I think what the types of folks that will get vaccinated, and this will be a quick aside, but I have to do it.
Yeah.
When red states, particularly small, poor red states, love to flap their gums about California and New York, I just want you to remember, Kentucky, that most of our tax dollars are going to you. So it's fine if you want to be all about your freedoms and liberties and you would never live in California. Let California keep all this tax money and let's see how you do. That's the 5th biggest economy on the planet Earth by itself.
And yet they're still in debt.
So I don't really particularly want to hear from states that aren't as economically viable, in the sense
One
that
would argue that California is unsustainable as a state, though.
True.
And so even if their tax dollars weren't disproportionately going to help Kentucky, they wouldn't be spent better in California.
That's fair, but at least let California make that
Oh,
determination.
absolutely.
Right?
No,
Like,
I
if
mean,
we're going...
so I'm very much like in favor of this argument,
Yeah.
right? Like, let's keep the money where the money is, but also then by the same token, let's stop bailing out big companies that are propped up in these cities that are garbage, honestly, because like I think we talked about it last week, but like think about the service you get from most of these large companies. It's the worst service. If a small business tried to offer you the type of service that like one of these large conglomerate does, they'd go out of business in a heartbeat. They'd lose customers. These businesses don't have to care about their customers. That's why they work.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Tangents aside, as we...
I honestly don't think it's a tangent this time, because like my question kind of gets back to a point you made earlier, right? With essentially businesses being able to discriminate against people, whatever you want to call it. I think one of the cool examples of it is Clear. And I say cool because I generally like it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds, right? So Clear is a company that's known for helping people get through airport security faster. Right. They have your identity on file. They have your fingerprints. Yep. They basically vetting you. You're paying an annual fee to kind of get through the airport. And now, like, with your COVID vaccination card, they're basically putting that on your digital profile and saying, hey, you go to this venue, you go to this restaurant, you're now cleared because this is your COVID pass.
Right.
So, the market could force people to get this because they won't be allowed in public spaces where it's required.
See, this is the slippery slope, but I think it's a lot safer from a private perspective.
Sorry.
From a private perspective.
What?
I'm sorry. We
derailed that.
Yeah,
Really
Jinx is
looking cute. An orange rind came through my straw.
Yeah, it's just a second.
But it was yours and not Kendall's.
But I think ultimately, that's where most folks will be forced to get it, because businesses already, I mean, frankly, if you're a customer or a patron of a business, right? Mm-hmm. We've agreed on certain core tenets. You shouldn't discriminate against people based on race, based on, gender, based on ability, those sorts of things.
Sexual identity.
But in the case of public health, and this gets into our personal health versus rights versus public health, if one of your customers is going to put all your other customers at risk, and those customers at risk have a legal case against you to sue you for negligence or whatever else it might be, I'm sorry, as a business, I'm going to say, hey, everybody has to be vaccinated, because it's just in our own best interest, frankly, and the interest of all of our customers from a health perspective. And also, I think when it comes to, that's the customer side, but employees, yeah, I'm paying you. Abso-freaking-lutely, you're getting the vaccine. I don't take a salary then. Go somewhere else if you don't want to. And that's kind of, I think, where we're going to go with that.
I don't know. There's part of me that's like, that's wrong, that's fucked up, but there's a part of me who's like, no, that's their choice, that's their right. But, you know, by that very same token, and not to, like, derail or go into something that's just I'm going to regret later for sure for saying, but, like, you know, the whole thing with bakeries not wanting to make wedding cakes for homosexuals. This to me feels very similar to that. And I understand the difference here, right? Public health, public good. This is for the benefit of the employees' customers, right? Still quantifying that, seems kind of tricky to me. It feels like a gray area. Like, how do you clearly define what public good is and why this public good is more important than your constitutional right, not necessarily to discriminate, but you're a private enterprise. If you don't choose to, have free market exchange with a certain group, isn't that sort of your right? Like, you're going to be known as the business that discriminates against these people, and that's probably going to drive people away from you as much as it might attract other people to you.
Here's where I would challenge that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the simple fact that if you're a part of the LGBTQ community, or even better, I'll speak about being black.
Yeah.
As a black person, if I walk into your establishment and I would like to buy a cake, and I want the people on top of the cake to be black, right? And you say, no, people on top of the cake have to be white. Yes, it is technically my right to walk out of that business and say, okay, whatever. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to sue you because my blackness literally hurts no one else at all. I'm just this, right? Whereas if you walk into a business and you have COVID or are at risk of COVID, which still is relatively deadly, especially to older Americans.
What if they don't tell you why they're not selling to you? I think this is the other thing where a lot of people kind of toe the line, right? Because it gets back to Trump allegedly not renting, and a whole lot of different developers, not just Trump. This is a huge industry-wide problem. But not renting to black people, basically, right? And you prove it basically by doing these undercover sort of studies where you kind of measure the rates of acceptance on these individuals who have basically identical backgrounds minus this one difference. Mm-hmm. How does I guess if you don't explicitly do it and you can show a pattern of bias, ultimately does it matter because it's still correlation, not causation?
I think ultimately it's a little bit like comparing apples to oranges in the sense that you either got the vaccine or you didn't get the vaccine, right?
Right.
And there's proof. Now, there are people trying to counterfeit and do things like that.
And there's also the element of, your health as a privacy is something that is protected because it can be used to discriminate against you, which is entirely why it exists to begin with, is to protect you from discrimination in the market.
True, but the problem is, man, we are
that's what HIPAA is, right?
Theoretical and philosophical, but
HIPAA, right, is so that insurance companies cannot discriminate against you to some extent.
It is true, but the problem is specifically with this, and I do think this is a particular case where by you asserting that right to privacy, you could literally be you could be writing somebody's death certificate. And that's the key. Mm-hmm. One, you could be writing somebody's death certificate. And two,
but how could you be writing someone's death certificate? Because even if you have the vaccine, you can still be a carrier. True. You can still get this virus.
It's just less likely to evidence of the you being a carrier less likely. Mm-hmm. It's not zero, but it is seen as far as the information that I've been seeing recently. Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody check me on that,
but at the same time, it's recycled air. You can carry it in on you if it's fresh enough.
Here's my thing.
If you're sick with it, yes.
Here's my thing. I think we could all agree that we as a society, we start to just agree on certain baselines. I think most of us have agreed that, look, in a world where a deadly pathogen exists, right? If you are vaccinated, nothing else we can do. Everybody, I'm just doing my thing. On the flip side of that, if you choose not to be vaccinated and you're in a place that attracts tens of thousands of people. Now, I'm not expecting the, like, grocery store in your town to check if people are vaccinated. I'm talking more like large enterprises where there are thousands of people, factories, airports, right? I get it, because not only is it a customer issue and an employee safety concern, it's also just like, yo, we don't want to have like a super spreader event, and then all of a sudden this virus mutates again, and now it's all deadly, and we got to start all over, because then our economy is going to be shot again. So I think in a lot of ways the argument comes down to, where's our baseline that we agree on, and what certain places does it really make sense to say, hey, is it worth putting other people at risk due to your personal rights? Because the problem is your personal rights can't infringe upon my personal rights. And that's
where we're in absolute agreement, because like, I always kind of say this offline, but like, I believe in like freedom and accountability for all. Like the whole idea of, you can do whatever you want so long as it does no harm or interfere at all with someone else. Like, without their consent, obviously.
Right.
Like, if two consenting parties want to do whatever they want to do, whatever. Like, that's their agreement. Like, that's kind of like the world we operate on. And so to me, like, reparations as a discussion was a discussion of a debt that's past due. Maybe not by myself, my family, or some other people in communities that are upset about the conversation around this, but by the people who still hold on to the economic output of that, which, are in positions of power and have real reasons for us not to agree on distributing that.
Right.
Because our decision would probably, again, bear the brunt on the public and not the individuals who are currently benefiting from it.
And I think, and this is kind of the other part that we wanted to hit, right? Talking about big versus small government and identity politics, and how, I mean, literally at this point, Ezra Klein wrote a great book called Why We're Polarized. You can basically, if somebody says they're a Democrat, you can figure out who that person is, right? In the same way that if somebody says they're a Republican, you can basically figure out who that person is, what profile they fit, what state they probably live in, all of these different things.
Or libertarian too.
Well, yeah.
It's a very different red.
Sure. And I, would also say the group that just calls themselves independents are the wild cards, though.
Yep.
Yeah.
But as much as the libertarians are, because they're just independents, because none of them agree on anything.
No. And I think ultimately it's an interesting discussion, because on one hand, you have folks who are eager to get this vaccine, and then on the other hand, you have folks who are very hesitant.
And I think we see that across the parties, which I think is something that the media tends to not really highlight here, is there's distrust in both parties for very different reasons.
Exactly.
That being said, like, just the fact that it exists is worth talking about, though.
I think that's where I was getting to, right? It's like,
sorry to jump the gun.
most black folks tend to vote Democratic, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of black people are really hesitant to get the vaccine. There was an article in the Free Press about there being a lot of vaccine hesitancy among African American folks. But then you also look at
White
folks,
evangelicals?
Yeah. I mean, and folks on the right, like white working class folks, they're listening to Fox News, right? They're listening to the president.
They said specifically white evangelicals. It seems like it's really coming out of the churches, honestly.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there are different reasons. But ultimately, I think that's kind of what we're getting at. And it is kind of philosophical, but that's why governing ourselves is such a complex task, because different groups of people, different individuals have different experiences.
And we
that
have to
inform
trust
it.
that those in power have the discipline not to abuse their power.
Exactly. And so then you look at, okay, well, if we go, like we talked about at the beginning, okay, let's say we go big with this one and we say everybody has to get the vaccine. Well, it could work out this time. But then let's say we do that and 30% of the people who got the vaccine died because we were wrong. Right? And this is where that balance between personal choice and collective action come into play. And I think, honestly, we are in a solid position to kind of let the process play out the way it is. Because now, 50 years ago, if we got a vaccine, it might have been 45% effective or 50% effective, where you really need those numbers to be up there to get herd immunity. We probably won't get herd immunity in our situation if 50% of U.S. adults decide they don't want the vaccine. But frankly, because I know I'm good and my family's good, I don't care. Don't get it. As long as you can't kill me or
It's
people
your
I
choice
love.
to die at that
Exactly.
point. Sorry.
Yeah, it's like if you want to risk it because you are worried about vaccines for whatever reason, you do you.
And
honestly.
To be honest, I think herd immunity is achievable, and it becomes now this balance between natural immunization through getting it and through, obviously, vaccination, because I think the number was something like 62%. I read it over the summer, so I don't really remember, but it was in the 60s or low 70s, and it seems that, you know, we have so many people who got the vaccine, we only need X number more to get sick with it. Not saying that that's what I'm hoping for, but at that point, then the transmission rate is so low that statistically we've got herd immunity.
Right, and I think what's really tough about it as well is most people have looked at it, and if you survive just fine, I think there's that lack of empathy there where you're like, bro, it's like the flu.
Or like, I just had a mild fever.
Yeah. Whereas like some people had their whole family wiped out.
Right.
Like kids had to bury both their parents and a sibling, and like, you know, there's that side of it.
And it almost felt like the disparities, at least in terms of like deaths, almost were felt more disproportionately in the cities than they were out in rural communities.
Exactly.
Obviously, the waves now hitting these communities now is, you know, much later, but we don't see the death rates that we did ever in the cities.
Exactly.
Because the magnitude of scale of a city and how easily their healthcare system gets back up. I mean, not to say that rural healthcare is like a gem by any means. Like, there are huge issues out with rural healthcare and the lack of healthcare professionals.
But they're more self-sustainable than something like urban areas.
They can manage the overload to some extent slightly better because they have more overflow capacity in other areas that a city just doesn't have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think ultimately where we end up with COVID and the vaccine is I think the hospital part is a big part of this, right? Because you don't want hospitals to be overrun. Our medical professionals, thank God for them, they have done
overworked and underpaid.
yeah, for a year now, people have literally fought a war against an enemy they can't see, right? Mm-hmm. But they feel it every day when they watch people die. And so, yeah, I think ultimately that is why I would err on the side, ultimately, of people who want to get the vaccine, go for it. And people who don't, you have to understand that if you end up with COVID, you could be a part of overwhelming hospital systems, right? And keeping folks who otherwise might have gotten treatment from getting treatment for different ailments. So that's the tough question. And
it's
I wish...
not just about you anymore.
Exactly. And I wish in America we weren't such an individualistic culture. I think is it Tibet? 93% of all adults already are vaccinated. Now again,
yeah,
super tiny country, but they're like, yeah, I just want to make sure my homies are okay. Right? Like, it's a very different way of being in the world than America, where it's like, nah, I don't really care about Joe Schmo.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of trust that can't be discounted because the government, like we said, there's a
True.
lot of historical reason not to trust necessarily everything's going
True.
on. I do want to emphasize that I believe in this vaccine and that I think that you should get it, right? I've looked at a lot of the data. It makes sense to me. I'm not saying I'm a data scientist. I'm not saying I'm a data scientist. I tried to study this stuff. This is something that resonates with me to some degree.
Yeah.
I have a whole nother discussion that we can save for another time about sort of the spat between, public healthcare sort of data scientists and data scientists in the industry at large, specifically Nate Silver. There was a big blow up this summer, basically, should he be allowed to weigh in on the discussion about public healthcare statistics as a statistician with a lot of range, a lot of background in the science behind the methodologies, who would understand essentially the cases that are being presented as evidence.
Right.
So I'll say that for another time. That's something that really interests me. We can go into that on a big data discussion or something because I think there's more there. But maybe even next week, continuing the discussion on healthcare. Like, it'd be great if we could get our friend Davin on board, potentially. Since I'm going to be in Nebraska for graduation, we'll be doing this as our first Zoom remote, meeting. Have a Zoom remote meeting guest.
Yeah, maybe we can make it happen. I think he would be such an interesting guest to have on.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think, and we can kind of make this one a little bit of a short podcast, like a part one almost.
Mm-hmm.
But I think ultimately the theme of big versus small government will continue to come up, right? Mm-hmm. I am a lover of FDR and Theodore Roosevelt, if that has not already come through. I am very much a believer in that a president ultimately puts everything on the table and just says, look, this is what we're doing. And I really don't care what Congress has to say because Congress is kind of, in my opinion,
a waste of money.
And yeah, it's useless. Congress is useless. I truly believe that. I don't think either house of Congress or either chamber of Congress, really worth that much. I need an executive that will ultimately say, this is the right answer. Or at least this is the answer that most of us choose. We're going with it. And if it goes wrong, it goes wrong.
I would prefer like a 3-person, executive council where all 3 representatives are the result of a popular vote. To me, because the balance of power, a way to be a tiebreaker, I see a lot of good in sort of that sort of balance. Anything beyond that becomes unmanageable, like we see. Yeah. I am small government in that I only think certain things should be regulated at the top, and then otherwise keep your hands the fuck out of it, because all that comes of this to me is corruption.
Yeah.
True.
I'm not saying don't set like some sort of standards or framework for self-regulation to some extent, because we need to make sure that everything is being done in the best interest. But honestly, I think transparency brings a lot of that, possibility to light, and that's where I get back into the blockchain bit that I always come back to is like trustless, verified data.
Yeah, I think for me, see, that's where I really struggle because of our history of race and racism, which we've talked about on the pod before. I really struggle with let it ride, everybody. Because I don't trust people. I really don't trust white America to just chill. I don't, and I think I have valid reasons for that.
Historically speaking, absolutely.
And I agree with you, but that's because they're always bending the rules and like putting them in their favor and suppressing voices. And I think the more that you put visibility on that, and we can all basically agree on what's happening, whether we want to call it by different terms, the numbers look the same, we're just drawing different conclusions. I'm okay with that, because I think that I have a lot of faith in people. I think that the society we have today is undereducated, but not without potential. I think that every individual in this country has like the ability to be a better version of themselves, and it's the way the world works now that's holding them back, and they don't have the ability to succeed. The opportunities aren't there.
Right.
And
it's not what you can do for this country, it's what this country can do for you. Like,
right, and we lost that a while ago. And so I would say that Teddy is my preferred of the two Roosevelts, but I do think that you need big, swift action. I don't know what it looks like. Sometimes it's UBI, sometimes it's a reform to the education system.
Yep.
I'm not sure. There's something there, but there is an element of big government that's necessary. It's just...
Where's that balance?
Right.
And I, as a big government person, 100% agree with you, especially in areas where we can clearly be more efficient. I just, like, why not do that?
Why do we subsidize garbage?
Yeah. Like, why?
Not garbage, the industry, just garbage in terms of output.
Yeah, it's exactly. Right? Certain things don't need to be subsidized.
The energy industry is always one I go back to.
Yeah.
I know we... Anyways.
But yeah.
To derail.
Yeah. Well...
Hey, to bring this back, I actually have a question. So you guys talked about it in market sense, the vaccine passports, but actually yesterday the Israel and Bahrain governments, I believe, are now requiring them to travel quarantine-free between the countries. So what do you guys think? Do you think there's going to be a big government role in vaccine passports in our country?
No, probably not within our country. I think it makes... So, for everyone who can't hear Cass right now, he basically just said, Israel and Bahrain passed essentially COVID passports. So in order to travel their countries, they need to show proof of vaccination in order to get in. And I think that on an international level, it makes sense, and I'm not surprised, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of it in the United States.
Yeah.
I could see it as an exclusionary thing where we won't let certain countries with people in because they don't have a vaccine. I could see that happening. I don't know.
Closed their borders to a few countries in the Middle East, India for their surge.
Canada closes their borders to a lot of people.
Yeah.
If you have a DUI, you can't go to Canada without special permission.
We still can't go to Canada.
Right.
Right. This is true.
So
I honestly think the U.S. government will probably institute something similar, but I think on a global scale, that just makes sense. It's like, we're not trying to add to these numbers. We're not trying to bring variance in.
Right.
That is what it is.
I think America's version of it will look something like Clear or another company like it, basically permissioning it. And you can choose who you want. They're going to suggest you do it, and it's going to make your life easier. Otherwise, you're going to go through quarantine and all these other things that's going to probably be costly or expensive to you that you don't want to do.
There's a quarantine aspect to that. But no, and I think kind of... one last tidbit, right? On the more private side, U of M is requiring every student that...
All right, that's how this idea kind of came up to talk about this.
Yeah, every student to get vaccinated. And again, now this one is a little bit different because...
It's a public institution.
Yeah, and also people are paying a whole lot of money to be here.
On the internet, not even here.
Yeah, but the problem is there again, and I think ultimately... U of M is right to do this because living in such close proximity, you're just asking for an event where everybody gets sick.
Right.
This is not a new thing.
I think what we're going to see, though, is U of M likes to be controversial and, leading and stuff, right? I think we're going to see an affirmative action, reversal on their decision, where it's no, you can't do this. You're a public institution. You've received public funds. This could be the thing that pushes Michigan over the edge to finally become a private college like it basically is anyways, but...
That's true. That's another discussion for another day.
I would love to go deep on this.
Yeah.
Just real brief, the university is older than the state, which gives it a lot more rights in terms of how it uses money from the federal government, and that's something they negotiated pre the establishment of the state.
Yeah. There's a lot of... U of M is going to push its weight around. But to be honest with you, how many people you really think are going to challenge this?
I think there's a lot of Michigander in-staters who are going to challenge this.
That's true. That's a good
because
point.
we still have, what, 40, almost 50% of the population still in state?
Yeah.
You know, like, there's plenty of people in the state who are red. This is a very purple state. You're going to see a lot of people pushing
Not
back
a
on this.
blended purple, like a very much opposite
Yeah.
sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think there will be people who are just contrarians. But then again, I think also then that's fine, but the school also has the right then to say, hey, you can't live on campus, bro. You can't, like, live in a dorm if you're not vaccinated.
I feel like
Right,
the slogan
but can you
is
still attend classes? And then
Michigan,
arguably,
stay
doesn't it
safe.
become just, like, arbitrary?
And state is going to be like, fuck it, do what you want. I mean, like, I think that's how
I
it's going to
think-
turn out 2021.
Yeah, sure, but, like, at the end of the day, I think there's going to be kids who want to go to Michigan because, no offense to state, they're a great school. Michigan's a prestigious university, like, or at least we tell everyone.
Right.
Yeah, I think ultimately though that's where, and it would be really interesting if this went to court and there was a case against it, because ultimately
Turning Point USA was on the diag the other day.
you probably side with people's personal rights, but I would also argue in this particular case, because this is a special case, it's a once in a century pandemic. Fine, side with people's personal rights, but then we just erode sort of our connectedness even more, where it's just like, literally, I do not care about the person next to me, even though we live in the same country.
Very
That's
true.
basically enshrining that in law, which is fine, but the I would argue the things that come from that, we're already seeing some of it, but it's going to get real bad. Like, what do you do when we need to make shared sacrifice?
I think so. This gets back to an argument I make all the time: is that I think Democrats do a terrible job of economically quantifying the problems that they want to solve. Because you're like, hey, look, energy's actually costing us X amount of money every year. Like, if we find a more sustainable way to do this, the long-term return on investment is this, and it's always going to outweigh what we're fucking doing today.
Right.
It's just, we're so myopic on everything that we give a shit about that, like,
Right.
we can't do this. So, I don't know, man. Like, it really bothers me that this is kind of like our situation, is that people cannot have the attention span to look down the road and see
Yeah.
how these alternatives are better use of our capital.
Ultimately, I think what you're getting at is just America is a very interesting country in that it promotes short-sighted thinking and individualism almost at all costs. And the problem is again, when once in a century pandemic comes, a lot more people died than probably should have died.
Right. And we're unable to quantify the economic cost of that and
Yeah.
say, all right, for your role in this economic cost, you're going to have to pay the price because it is a cost of the product you produce. And, you know, some people want to levy it as a tax. I just think we should just charge it as a cost, arguably because it is a market cost. If you don't pay it, then you're essentially, you know, there's a debt unpaid there.
Yeah.
You know, whatever.
No,
I don't know.
Well, I think we can kind of wrap it up there. You all keep arming yourselves with knowledge. This is Armin Main Street. We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks
Peace.
for listening, guys.